Gary Metzger had been buying equipment from Riverside John Deere in Ames, Iowa, for 22 years. He was 51 years old, and he farmed 1,100 acres of corn and soybeans in Story County. Over those 22 years, he had bought 11 tractors, 3 combines, 2 planters, and more implements than he could accurately count from that dealership. He had financed most of it through Riverside. He had done his service work there. He had bought his parts there. He had referred 3 neighbors to the dealership, all of whom had become regular customers. Gary estimated that over 22 years, his business had put somewhere between $3 and $4 million through Riverside John Deere. He was their customer. He was a good customer. He was the kind of customer that a dealership built its business around. And in the fall of 2022, he walked away from all of it, not because he wanted to, because Phil Radner, the owner of Riverside John Deere, gave him no other choice. The dispute started with a warranty claim in the summer of 2022. Gary's 2020 John Deere 8R.340 developed a transmission fault at 3,200 hours. The machine was under its extended warranty. The fault was a known issue with that generation of IVT transmission. Deere had issued a technical service bulletin about it in 2021. Gary brought the tractor to Riverside. The service manager ran diagnostics. The fault was confirmed. The repair estimate was $42,000. Gary said the warranty should cover it. The service manager said he would submit the claim. 2 weeks later, Phil Radner called Gary personally and said the warranty claim had been denied. Phil said Deere Corporate had reviewed the maintenance records and determined that Gary had used an off-brand hydraulic fluid during a service interval in 2021, which voided the powertrain warranty. Gary said that was not accurate. He had used the fluid specified in the service manual. Phil said the records showed otherwise. Gary asked to see the records. Phil said the denial was based on Deere Corporate's assessment and the dealership had no control over the outcome. Gary said he wanted to appeal. Phil said Gary could contact Deere Corporate directly. Gary spent 3 weeks on the phone with Deere's Customer Resolution Department. He submitted his own maintenance records. He submitted receipts showing the correct fluid had been purchased and used. Deere Corporate reviewed it and came back with the same answer: warranty denied. Gary would have to pay $42,000 out of pocket for a repair on a machine that was 3 years old and under warranty. Gary paid it. He had no choice. He needed the tractor for harvest. But something changed in him that fall. 22 years of loyalty calcified into something harder. Gary spent the winter researching. He talked to other farmers who had switched brands. He visited a Massey Ferguson dealer in Nevada, Iowa, a man named Doug Kramer who had been in business for 18 years. Doug was straightforward with Gary. He showed him his service response metrics: average time to diagnosis, average time to repair completion, warranty claim approval rates, parts availability by category. Doug had numbers for everything. He showed Gary the Massey Ferguson 8S series side by side with the John Deere 8R in spec comparisons. He showed Gary financing options. He showed Gary resale data for comparable machines. He spent 4 hours with Gary over 2 visits and never once said a negative word about John Deere. He just showed Gary what Massey Ferguson offered and let Gary make the decision. In February 2023, Gary made it. He called Doug and said he was ready to switch the entire fleet. The trade-in assessments took 2 weeks. Gary's fleet consisted of 4 John Deere tractors, a 2020 8R340, a 2018 7R290, a 2019 6R165, and a 2016 5150M utility. He also had 2 John Deere S780 combines, a 2021 and a 2019. Doug sent an independent appraiser who spent 2 days on the farm. The trade values came back. The 8R.340 at $280,000 despite the transmission repair. The repair had been done well and the machine was otherwise solid. The 7R290 at $190,000. The 6R165 at $135,000. The 5150M at $62,000. The 2021 S780 at $390,000. The 2019 S780 at $310,000. Total trade package, $1,367,000. Doug proposed replacement Massey Ferguson equipment, an 8S305 for the big tractor, a 7S2110 for the mid, a 6S180 for the row crop, a 4708 for the utility, an MF955 combine for the primary machine, and a 7360 for the secondary. The purchase price for the new fleet was $1,580,000. The difference was $213,000. Gary financed it through Massey Ferguson Financial Services at 7.8%. The trades were executed in March 2023. Gary drove the last John Deere off his farm on a Thursday afternoon and watched a flatbed haul it to Riverside. He stood in his yard and looked at the machine shed, still half full of green equipment waiting to be traded, and felt something he hadn't expected. Not triumph. More like exhaustion, like the end of something long. By the following Tuesday, the Massey Ferguson fleet was in the shed, red machines in a row where green had been for 22 years. Gary stood in the doorway and looked at them. Doug had sent a technician to spend a day familiarizing Gary and his hired hand with the new systems. The technician was thorough and patient. Gary felt like he was learning to drive again. But he also felt, for the first time in months, like someone had treated him like a valued customer. Phil Radner heard about the switch the same week. Gary hadn't called him. The trades had been handled directly between the two dealerships and through the financing companies. Phil found out through the Deere rep who called him, wondering why Gary's account had gone dark. Phil called Gary on a Friday morning. Gary let it go to voicemail. Phil left a message saying he had heard Gary had made some equipment changes and wanted to talk. Gary called back on Monday. The conversation was brief. Phil said he understood Gary was unhappy about the warranty situation, but hoped they could maintain a relationship going forward. Gary said there wasn't much of a relationship left to maintain. Phil said he hoped Gary would reconsider. Gary said he had reconsidered for 6 months, and this was where he had landed. Phil said he was sorry to hear that. His voice was professional, controlled. Gary thanked him and hung up. It seemed like a clean ending. It was not a clean ending. 6 weeks after the switch, Gary's hired hand, a man named Keith who had worked for Gary for 8 years, went to Riverside John Deere to buy a hydraulic fitting for an old grain cart that Gary still owned. The cart was a 2014 John Deere model, and the fitting was a standard part. Keith told the counterman what he needed. The counterman checked the system. He said the part was on back order. Keith asked when it would be in. The counterman said he wasn't sure, could be 2 to 3 weeks. Keith thanked him and left. On the drive home, Keith called 2 other John Deere dealers in the region. The first one in Boone had the part in stock. The second one in Marshalltown also had it in stock. Keith called Gary and told him. Gary drove to Boone and bought the part himself. He said nothing to Phil, but he noted it. 2 weeks after the parts incident, Gary was at the co-op in Ames loading fertilizer. A neighbor named Dennis came over and said he had heard some things. Dennis said Phil had been telling people around the county that Gary's new Massey Ferguson fleet was going to have problems by harvest. Phil had been specific, Dennis said. He had been saying the MF9505 combine had known grain loss issues in corn over 200 bushels, that the 8S CVT was prone to failure in heavy ground, and that Gary had made a serious financial mistake that was going to hurt his operation. Gary stood by the fertilizer bay and listened to Dennis. He asked if Dennis had heard this directly. Dennis said yes, at a farm meeting at the extension office 2 weeks ago. Phil had been there as a sponsor. Dennis said Phil had brought up Gary's name unprompted while talking about the importance of brand relationships and long-term dealer support. He had said Gary's switch was a cautionary tale in the making. Dennis said people had been listening. Gary thanked Dennis and drove home. He called Doug Kramer and told him what he had heard. Doug said he had heard similar things from 2 of his other customers. He said Phil had been making calls. Gary asked what calls. Doug said Phil had apparently been in contact with farmers who were considering switching to Massey Ferguson and telling them negative things about the brand, using Gary as an example. Gary said Phil had no current examples. The Massey Fergusons had been on the farm for 6 weeks and had 0 issues. Doug said that was correct. But the damage from the narrative didn't require evidence. It just required repetition. Gary called a lawyer in Des Moines. The lawyer's name was Ann Cho, and she specialized in business and agricultural law. Gary explained the situation: the warranty denial, the switch, the parts refusal, the co-op comments, the calls to potential Massey Ferguson customers. Ann listened carefully. She said the parts refusal, if deliberate, was potentially actionable as tortious interference. She said the comments at the co-op and the calls to other farmers were potentially actionable as defamation or tortious interference with business relations, depending on what exactly had been said. She said Gary needed documentation before she could advise him more specifically. She said he needed witnesses to the co-op comments. He needed records of the parts refusals. He needed information about who Phil had called and what he had said. Gary said he would get it. Ann said to call her back when he had something concrete. Gary hung up and started making phone calls. Over the next 3 weeks, Gary collected information. Dennis gave a written statement about the co-op comments. 2 other farmers, a man named Ray and a woman named Connie, both confirmed they had received calls from Phil or from people Phil had asked to call them, warning them against switching to Massey Ferguson and specifically mentioning Gary's situation as evidence of poor judgment. Keith documented the parts refusal, including the timestamps of his call to Riverside and his calls to the 2 dealers who had the part in stock. Gary subpoenaed the parts inventory records from Riverside through a discovery request attached to a preliminary filing. The records showed the part had been in stock at Riverside when Keith asked for it. The counterman had checked the wrong system, or had been told to say it was on back order. The records also showed that 2 days after Keith's visit, the part had been marked as transferred to a different account. Someone had physically moved the part out of inventory to create the appearance of unavailability. Gary brought all of this to Ann Cho. Ann filed a civil lawsuit against Phil Radner and Riverside John Deere in Story County District Court in June 2023. The claims were tortious interference with business relations, defamation, and intentional interference with contractual relations. The filing asked for compensatory damages and punitive damages. Phil hired a defense attorney from Des Moines named Harlan Burke. Harlan was good. He filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that Phil's comments about Gary's equipment choice were protected opinion and that the parts refusal was a business decision within the dealer's discretion. The motion was denied. The case went to discovery, and discovery was where everything changed. Ann's team issued document requests and deposition notices. They deposed Phil. They deposed the counterman. They deposed the Riverside service manager. They requested all communications related to Gary's account going back 5 years. They requested Phil's phone records. They requested email correspondence. What came back was more than Gary had expected. Phil had not just retaliated against Gary. The discovery documents showed a pattern going back 8 years. In 2015, a farmer named Harold had switched from John Deere to Case IH after a dispute with Riverside over a used equipment misrepresentation. Within 3 months of Harold's switch, Phil had contacted Harold's primary lender and suggested that Harold's operation was financially unstable due to the equipment transition. The lender had tightened Harold's operating line by $40,000. Harold had not been able to prove why his credit had tightened and had assumed it was the bank's own assessment. He had never connected it to Phil. In 2018, a farmer named Susan had switched to Massey Ferguson after comparing prices and dealer service ratings. Phil had contacted 2 of Susan's major grain buyers and suggested, without specific evidence, that Susan's operation was going through financial restructuring. The grain buyers had required Susan to begin selling on spot price rather than forward contracts, which had cost her a significant price premium over the following 2 years. Susan had attributed the change to market conditions. She had not known about Phil's calls. In 2021, a farmer named Tom had switched to New Holland after a parts availability dispute. Phil had told Tom's insurance agent, a man who handled both farm insurance and Phil's personal accounts, that Tom had made some decisions that raised questions about his business judgment. The insurance agent had raised Tom's premium at renewal. Tom had shopped his insurance and moved to a different carrier, but he had paid higher rates for 18 months and had never known why. 4 farmers across 8 years. Each one had experienced unexplained financial pressure after switching away from Riverside John Deere. Each one had assumed the pressure was unrelated to their equipment switch. None of them had connected the dots until Ann Cho's discovery team laid the documents side by side in a conference room in Des Moines and showed Gary what they had found. Gary sat in that conference room and read through the files. Harold, Susan, Tom, and himself. 4 people whose operations Phil had quietly worked to damage because they had exercised their right to buy equipment from someone else. Phil had done it carefully, never directly, always through intermediaries. A word to a lender, a suggestion to a grain buyer, a comment to an insurance agent. Nothing that could be traced easily to a specific claim of fact. Just enough to create doubt. Just enough to tighten credit, raise premiums, reduce contract opportunities. Just enough to hurt without leaving fingerprints. Ann brought Harold, Susan, and Tom into the lawsuit as additional plaintiffs. The case expanded significantly. The damages calculation grew. Harold's credit tightening had cost him an estimated $62,000 in lost operating capacity over the years after Phil's call. Susan's spot price requirement had cost her somewhere between $80,000 and $100,000 in lost price premiums. Tom's insurance premium increase had cost him around $14,000 before he switched carriers. Gary's credit line tightening had cost him $60,000 in a critical planting season. Combined with the warranty dispute that had started everything, the damages claim totaled over $400,000 for the 4 plaintiffs. The punitive damages request was 3 times that amount based on the deliberate and repeated nature of Phil's conduct. Phil's defense collapsed in October 2023. Harlan Burke told Phil that the discovery evidence was not survivable at trial. The pattern was too clear, the documentation was too specific, the depositions of the intermediaries, the lender, the grain buyers, the insurance agent had established that Phil had made the contacts and that the contacts had caused the financial harm. Phil would not be able to argue coincidence with 4 separate plaintiffs over 8 years, each with documented third-party contacts from Phil following their departure from Riverside. Harlan told Phil he needed to settle. Phil said he wasn't going to settle because he hadn't done anything wrong. He had made business decisions and expressed opinions, and there was nothing illegal about that. Harlan said the jury would see it differently. He said the jury would see a dealer who had spent 8 years methodically damaging the operations of farmers who had the audacity to take their business elsewhere. Harlan said Phil needed to think very carefully about what a jury of farmers in Story County would do with that story. Phil went home and thought about it. He called Harlan back 2 days later and said to start settlement discussions. The settlement was finalized in January 2024. The terms were confidential, but Ann told her clients it was the largest settlement she had obtained in 17 years of agricultural law practice. Each plaintiff received compensation for their documented damages plus a substantial additional amount. Phil sold Riverside John Deere to a management group in March 2024. He retired. He moved to Florida. The dealership continued operating under new ownership. The new owner reached out to Gary in April and asked if Gary would consider bringing his service work to Riverside. Gary said he appreciated the call. He said he was happy with his current dealer relationship, but he would keep the offer in mind. The new owner said he understood. He said he hoped the situation with the previous ownership hadn't reflected on the dealership permanently. Gary said time would tell. Gary's Massey Ferguson fleet completed its first full crop year in 2023 without a single major mechanical failure. The 9505 combine performed without the grain loss issues Phil had predicted. The 8S305 pulled through Story County clay without the CVT problems Phil had described. Gary's harvest finished on time. His yield was above his 5-year average. His operating costs were lower than they had been with the John Deere fleet because the service costs at Doug Kramer's dealership were lower and the response times were faster. Gary called Doug in November after harvest was finished and told him all of this. Doug said he was glad to hear it. Gary said he had one question. He asked if Doug had ever heard of Phil calling potential Massey Ferguson customers to warn them off. Doug was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had suspected it for years. He said he had lost 3 sales in Story County over an 18-month period that he had never been able to explain. Potential customers who had come in, shown genuine interest, and then gone cold without explanation. Gary said he thought that might be part of the lawsuit discovery. He told Doug to have his attorney contact Ann Cho. Doug said he would. By the spring of 2024, Gary had been running Massey Ferguson equipment for a year. The machines had proven themselves. The dealer relationship with Doug had proven itself. The lawsuit had been resolved. The man who had tried to damage his operation was retired and gone. Gary stood in his machine shed on a morning in April, looking at the red fleet lined up the way the green fleet had been lined up for 22 years before it, and he thought about what Phil had done. He thought about the calculated patience of it, the way Phil had worked through intermediaries, the way he had spread the damage across years so no single action was obvious, the way 4 farmers had suffered financial harm without ever knowing who had caused it or why. Gary thought about Harold losing $62,000 in operating capacity. He thought about Susan losing price premiums for 2 years. He thought about Tom paying higher insurance rates for 18 months. He thought about himself standing at the co-op counter in June 2023, unable to access $60,000 he needed for planting because a man he had given 22 years of business had made a phone call to his lender. Phil had done all of that because they had bought a different tractor, because they had decided that their money and their operation and their professional judgment belonged to them, not to the dealer who had benefited from their loyalty for years. Gary locked the machine shed and drove to the co-op. He had work to do. The Massey Fergusons were ready. The ground was ready. The season was starting. And nobody was going to call his lender this year.